provided over $2 trillion in taxpayer-backed loans and other financial assistance to some of the largest financial institutions and corporations in the world. Let me repeat that. Over $2 trillion, with a T, $2 trillion. Over a year ago, as a member of the Budget Committee, I asked Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Fed, a very simple question. Very simple question. Couldn't be simpler. And the question in so many words was, Mr. Bernanke, you lent out $2 trillion. Who got that money? Who received the money? What were the terms of those loans? And Mr. Bernanke's answer was, no, not going to tell you, Senator Sanders, not going to tell the Budget Committee, and I am not going to tell the American people. And I think that that is outrageous. I think when $2 trillion of taxpayers' money is placed at risk, the American people have a right to know. How many debates have we had here on the floor of the Senate about legislation of $5 million, of $30 million, feverish debate, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, and now you're looking at trillions of dollars of taxpayer money being placed at risk, and we don't know who received that. That, to me, is an outrage, and that, to me, is unacceptable. On that very day, after Ben Bernanke denied the American people the right to know who received those loans, I introduced legislation requiring the Fed to put that information on their website. Madam President, you know as well as I do that millions of lives have been ruined by the greed, the recklessness, and the illegal behavior of Wall Street. And while the Fed was providing secret loans at virtually no interest to some of the largest financial institutions in this country, millions of Americans were losing their jobs, their homes, their life savings, their ability to send their kids to college as a direct result of the same Wall Street firms that the Fed was propping up. So you have a situation where all over this country families are suffering, small and medium-sized businesses are in desperate need of affordable loans, and yet you have the Fed providing trillions of dollars to the people who caused the recession and to some of the wealthiest and most powerful CEOs in the country. The very least that we can do for the American people is to tell them, to give them the information as to who got bailed out by the Fed. I don't think that that is too much to ask. We have to explore whether or not there were conflicts of interest. How does it work when financial institutions get huge amounts of zero or near zero interest loans? Who sits on the committee? Are there conflicts of interest? We have to know, for example, what I believe to be the case, that some of those financial institutions that receive billions in zero or near zero interest loans may have invested that money in T-bills, in Treasury bonds, earning 3 or 4%. Now, what kind of scam is that? You get zero interest loans from the Fed, and then you invest in government-backed T-bonds at 3 or 4%. That is an incredible scam. Did some of those financial institutions do that? I suspect they did. But we don't know what they did with that money, and we have a right to find out. Madam President, let us be very clear. The money put at risk does not belong to the Fed. It belongs to the American people, and the American people have a right to know where their taxpayer dollars are going. Therefore, Madam President, during the debate on financial reform, I will be offering an amendment to audit the Federal Reserve and to require that the Fed release all of the details regarding the more than $2 trillion in virtually zero-interest loans the Fed has provided to large financial institutions since the beginning of the economic crisis. This amendment, we talk a lot around here about the need for bipartisanship or tripartisanship. I'm an independent. Well, this amendment really does that. I don't know that there's any amendment out there that has more bipartisan support. This amendment is being co-sponsored by Senators Feingold, Leahy, Wyden, Dorgan, and Boxer, Democrats. It is being co-sponsored by Senators DeMint, McCain, Grassley, Vitter, Brownback, Graham, Risch, and Wicker, Republicans. But quite significantly, on the base bill that I introduced, from which this amendment comes, this legislation is being supported by 32 co-sponsors, and that is 22 Republicans and 10 Democrats. And they run the gambit from some of the most conservative members of the Senate to some of the most progressive. And the senators who are supporting the base bill are Senators Barrasso, Bennett of Utah, Boxer, Brownback, Burr, Cardin, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Dorgan, Feingold, Graham, Grassley, Harkin, Hatch, Hutchinson, Inhofe, Isaacson, Landrieu, Leahy, Lincoln, McCain, Murkowski, Risch, Thune, Vitter, Webb, Wicker, and Wyden. That is a very broad cross-section of the United States Senate, from some of the most conservative to some of the most progressive members on the base bill, who say that it is absurd that the Fed could lend out trillions of dollars without the American people knowing who has received that money. And let me just tell you what our amendment would do. And it's pretty simple. Number one, it would require the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office, the GAO, to conduct an independent and comprehensive audit of the Fed within 1 year. And secondly, it would require the Fed to disclose the names of the financial institutions that received over $2 trillion in virtually zero-interest loans since the start of the recession. That's it. That's the whole amendment. Pretty simple. And I would hope and expect that we would have widespread bipartisan support for this amendment when it gets to the floor. Madam President, this amendment also has widespread community support from organizations all over this country. It has the support of the Americans for Financial Reform, a coalition of over 250 consumer, employee, investor, community, and civil rights groups, including the AFL-CIO and the AARP. I should also mention that increasing transparency at the Fed is obviously something that the American people want to see, and poll after poll suggests that. Madam President, this bill is similar, this amendment is similar to the Federal Reserve Transparency Act that was introduced in the House by Congressman Ron Paul and now has 320 bipartisan co-sponsors. That's a lot. 435 members, 320 are on the House bill. And a version of that bill passed the House Financial Services Committee by a vote of 43 to 28 and was incorporated into the financial reform bill that passed the House last December. So not only do we have widespread bipartisan support in the Senate, that same type of support exists in the House. Last year, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said that Congress should ask the Fed to put this information, quote, on the Internet like they've done with the recovery package and the budget, end of quote. And that's exactly what this amendment would do. Madam President, interestingly enough, not only do we have widespread bipartisan support in the Congress, not only is the House moving vigorously on this issue already, but importantly, the courts have ruled in support of what we are trying to do. Bloomberg News has been very aggressive on this issue, and they have won 2 court decisions requiring the Fed to release this information to the public. But despite widespread congressional support, despite 2 court decisions, the Fed continues to resist the transparency which our country desperately needs. Madam President, as long as the Fed is allowed to keep the information on their loans secret, we may never know the true financial condition of the banking system. And this has resulted in a whole myriad of problems, and I think it's time that we brought some sunshine to the goings-on of the Fed. Madam President, let me just conclude by saying this. The American people are outraged, regardless of their political views, by the behavior of Wall Street. They have seen the greed of Wall Street lead us into a recession in which millions of jobs have been lost, homes have been lost, savings have been lost, families have been destroyed. And they want to make sure that we do everything that we can to make sure that what caused this terrible recession never happens again. And I think one of the most important things that we can do in terms of Wall Street reform is to bring transparency to the Fed. So, Madam President, this is an incredibly simple amendment. This is an amendment that has grassroots support. This is an amendment that has support from the most progressive and conservative members of the Congress. And when I bring this amendment up, I would certainly hope that we can get a great deal of support from members of the Senate.
Question.
I would be very pleased to yield to my friend from
I'd like to ask
the senator from Illinois.
I'd like to ask the Senator from Vermont, through the chair, about another issue in this bill relative to the interest rates that are being charged across America. And I'd like to ask the senator from Vermont if he would tell me his take or evaluation of the provision in this bill which exempts usury laws and interest rates from the consideration of the Consumer Financial Protection Agency. I know that the presiding officer here has an interest in some exploitation that is occurring in her state of North Carolina and frankly in my state of Illinois and probably across this nation by the so-called payday loans and title loan operations where average people who are struggling economically go in for high-interest loans that are then rolled over time and time and time again until they lose whatever security has been offered for the loan and frankly find themselves even deeper in debt. I'd like to ask the senator from Vermont, who I've discussed this with on many occasions, his thoughts about consumer financial protection and the interest rates being charged across this nation.
Well, I thank my friend from Illinois for raising that question, and I want to congratulate him because our colleagues should know that he has been a leader on this issue for many years and has already achieved some significant success. My memory is that we had payday lenders who, if you can believe this, Madam President, were charging men and women in the United States Armed Forces, who in many cases don't have a lot of money, who are trying to take care of their families, outrageously high interest rates on check cashing and payday loans. And the senator from Illinois led the effort successfully to put a cap on that, and I thank him very much for doing that. That's a start, but clearly, as the senator from Illinois indicates, we've got to go further. And here's the story. Madam President, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a rally right here on Capitol Hill led by religious groups, who said that it is immoral and unacceptable that in the United States of America, what we are now seeing is usury and loan sharking taking place by some of the largest financial institutions in this country. So we're not just talking, I would say to my friend from Illinois, about an economic issue. We're talking about a basically moral issue. And if you read the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, every major religion on this planet has said that usury is immoral, that if you are desperate and you need money, I cannot charge you outrageously high interest rates. That's just immoral and the wrong thing to do. And yet in this country today, as a result of a Supreme Court decision some years ago, you have millions of Americans who are paying 25, 30, 35, 40% interest rates. And this is not from loan shark gangsters on a street corner in Chicago. This is from some of the largest, most distinguished financial institutions in the world. We've got to put an end to that. And I would tell my friend from Illinois that the legislation that we have offered would put a cap of 15%, except under extraordinary circumstances, on the interest rates that the banks can charge the American people. And we came up with this idea because this is what credit unions in this country have been doing for several decades, and they've been doing it successfully.
I'd like to ask, through the chair again, Senator from Vermont. First, I want to give credit where it's due. The original amendment that he talked about that protected military families was offered by Senator Jim Talent of Missouri. And I supported it. Everyone supported it because we found men and women in the military trained to defend our country who signed up for these payday loans and quick loans. They became so deeply mired in debt, they were forced to leave military service. And so we said, as a matter of national security, we can't sacrifice well-trained men and women who can keep us safe as a nation to loan sharks who have these storefront operations in my hometown of Springfield and your hometown in Vermont and all across the nation. I would say to the senator from Vermont, he and I have joked about this a little bit, but I tried to come up with a number and said this will be the maximum interest rate that can be charged. I went to a mutual friend whom I respect and said, what is a number that no one can argue with? And she said 36%. And when I mentioned that number to people back in Illinois and other places, they're aghast. They said, we don't want to pay 36% for anything. And I said, I don't either, but this is like a ceiling. Well, it turned out it's a little more confusing than illuminating. And I happen to think that the senator from Vermont is certainly right with the cap that he is suggesting. Now, is it not true, I asked the senator from Vermont, that as this roll call vote reflects, that if the Republican senators in this chamber continue this filibuster against this financial reform bill, this Wall Street reform bill, this consumer financial protection bill, we can't even engage in this debate, let alone this amendment, to try to protect families across America from being preyed upon by these outrageous reptilian credit operations.
Well, the senator from Illinois, Madam President, is of course absolutely right. And what the senator from Illinois, the point that he is making, which makes eminent sense, if our friends disagree, if our friends want to offer amendment, if the Republicans want to alter the bill, that is their right. That's what the Senate is about. But we can't proceed and go forward in putting a cap on the outrageous interest rates that financial institutions are charging the American people, the loan sharking, unless we get this bill going. We can't talk about Fed transparency unless we get this bill going. So I certainly agree with my friend from Illinois. People have a right to disagree, but the American people are disgusted and frustrated with what's going on Wall Street. They want action. And to simply have our Republican friends saying, no, 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 we're not going forward, it doesn't make any sense to me.
I'd ask the senator from Vermont through the chair, as informative and entertaining as our presentations are on the floor, the fact is that 98 chairs here are empty on the Senate floor, chairs that could be filled with members of the Senate from both political parties debating the issues we're talking about, actually voting on amendments, proposing changes in the law to ultimately work with the House and send to the President to solve some of the problems facing our nation. But as long as we are facing, and we've had 3 filibuster votes so far this week, more to follow, as long as we are facing this Republican filibuster, where not one single Republican senator will break with the Republican caucus or the Wall Street position that opposes any reform, we can't even bring this bill to the floor for debate so that we can address the biggest economic and financial challenge America has faced in decades.
Madam President, I would say that my friend from Illinois is exactly right. Let me just add to it. You got the House of Representatives. They voted to go forward. You got the President of the United States. He wants to go forward. You got 57 or whatever it is senators here who want to go forward. Now is the time to go forward. I would add to what my friend from Illinois has just said, let's be very clear about this. Last year in 2009, as I understand it, our friends on Wall Street, who are doing everything they can to make sure that Congress does nothing to reform the way they do business. That's what they want. Let's be clear about it. You know what they spent last year? I would tell my friend from Illinois that my understanding is they spent $300 million on lobbying and campaign contributions. And I know my friend from Illinois knows that you can't walk around the Capitol without bumping into one or another lobbyist representing Wall Street. And why are they here? Why are they representing hedge fund managers who make billions of dollars in a year? They want to continue to be able to do the exact same things they've done in the past, which has led to this terrible, terrible recession. So let's not be naive. There are huge amounts of money flooding Capitol Hill right now, and the goal is, no matter what anybody may say, let's do no Wall Street reform.
I thank the senator from Vermont for yielding for questions, and I would yield the floor, and unless someone seeks recognition.
The senator from Illinois for his continued efforts on Wall Street reform and the excellent work that he has done.